to the Naked Tarot Podcast with your host, Janet Boyer. Get ready to strip down with the most provocative voice in tarot.
Hello, and welcome to the Naked Tarot Podcast. I'm your host, Janet Boyer, otherwise known as the Tarot Maven. I'm the author of Back in Time Tarot, Tarot in Reverse, and the upcoming Naked Tarot Sassy Strip Down Advice. With my artist husband, Ron Boyer, I'm also the co-creator of the Snowland deck and the Coffee Tarot. I invite you to visit my website, janetboyer.com, where hundreds of reviews and other goodies await. If you'd like to support my work, I'm also on Patreon at patreon.com/Janet Boyer, where I provide exclusive monthly Astro Tarot forecasts for my patrons, as well as weekly spreads, inspired art, behind the scenes of my work in progress, and other goodies. Today, we're going to be talking about the Scary Terry Swords cards. What are they afraid of? Now, every card in the tarot can be seen through myriad lenses, and that is one of the fascinating things I find about tarot, that it just never ends, the discoveries that you can have with the cards. All you need to do is just change up the kind of glasses you see them through. So imagine before you, let's say John Lennon glasses, those little circular glasses. Imagine you have about 7 of them. We'll just do the Roy G. Biv: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Okay, now each of those glasses have different tinted lens. Red tint, orange tint, yellow tint, green tint, and so on. Now, just like in reality, if you were to pick up one of those sets of glasses and put them on, those lenses would tint everything you saw, right? I mean, you look at the sky. If you have red glasses on, the sky looks red. If you'd have the blue lens on, the sky would look blue. Well, we can see the tarot cards through various lenses, and those lenses can be through emotions, they can be through pop culture, they can be through archetypes, personality traits, so many lenses. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to take those supposedly scary swords cards, which I must say is one of my favorite suits actually, and we're going to look through every card in the sword suit through the lens of fear. And one of the reasons why is the swords cards do deal with fear, but they also deal with things like the intellect, the mental realm, thoughts, analysis, judgment, bias, opinion, prejudice. And so we're going to look through the lens of fear every single card. Now, we could also, look through the swords card through the lens of love. What does every card love? But I thought we would talk about what is at the psychological root of the swords card, since it's a suit that is often associated with strife and dread, anxiety, worry, and fear, and see what, dig a little deeper and see what each card is afraid of at the root. Now, the Ace of Swords is the card of clarity. Now, the solution to all the negative vibes or challenges of any suit lies in the ace of that suit. Now, let me repeat that little secret for you. The solution to all the negative vibes or challenges of any of the 4 minor arcana suit, that would be the cups, swords, pentacles, or wands, lies in the ace of that suit. So for the sword suit, the Ace of Swords is clarity. Now, this is the card that is akin to a pin that busts the balloon of confusion, illusion, and self-delusion. So I like to see that sort of, as cutting through the bullshit, cutting through the fog, parting the Red Sea, so to speak. And I actually, for the 2017 International Tarot Day deck, I had the Ace of Swords card, and I actually showed a pin straight up as if that were the sword and there was a balloon floating by. And in our Snowland deck, there is a snowman who is awaiting the hand out of the cloud, and the cloud is a huge icicle instead of a sword, and in the background there are balloons floating. And that is kind of our hint to say that the Ace of Swords brings clarity by oftentimes popping the balloon of, hot air, but also confusion, illusion, and self-delusion. So for the sword suit, the Ace of Swords is the solution to the negative vibes or challenges that is contained within all the other cards. because there's nothing like confidence, power, clarity, and seeing things for what they are to dispel fear, which is often, as an acronym, false evidence appearing real. So let's start with the Two of Swords. Now, the Two of Swords in the Rider-Waite often shows, it does show a woman who's blindfolded with swords in front of her. And I have found that the Two of Swords, the underlying fear is the fear of seeing the truth. Because there's a fear of, there's an uncertainty, there's duality is more comfortable for the person than actually choosing a side. And the Two of Swords with the Rider-Waite, it's the crossed swords in the sky. There's a moon, and it's said to be like a moon in Gemini. And Gemini is about duality and almost two-facedness, or two distinct, almost like a personality split. So when the Two of Swords comes up, I often see there's a fear of seeing the truth, and that they would actually appreciate the uncertainty or duality more than they would knowing the truth. And a prime example of this, and I have this in my book, Tarot in Reverse, with Two of Swords reversed, is the wife of BTK, the serial killer, Dennis Rader. And a lot of the, indications was there that something was seriously wrong. Maybe not that he was the serial killer, but she actually saw when the newscaster presented one of the notes that the serial killer left, she actually said to him while they were watching the newscast, wow, he spells like you do. And I'm thinking, oh, how blind can you be? And she caught him in other weird situations. And, some would have sympathy and say, well, how could she possibly know? I think that the underlying fear of the Two of Swords is fear of seeing the truth. The flags are there, the alarm bells are there, but because the individual doesn't want the world shaken or upset in any way, they're actually more comfortable having the uncertainty or the illusion of uncertainty. So the underlying fear for the Two of Swords is the fear of seeing the truth. Then we go into the Three of Swords, which often shows a heart pierced with three swords. In our Snowland deck, it shows a wolf who has crossed a ravine with broken trees, and he has left the tribe, left the pack, and he's the lone wolf now. And the underlying fear for the Three of Swords is a fear of heartbreak or grief or loss. And that's pretty self-evident, but the reason why I'm undergoing the underlying fears is because sometimes, especially if these cards show up reversed, it could be tricky for people to know how to interpret them, or even ill-dignified, or even if it's in supposedly a positive position of a spread. If it's like a positive outcome, what does it mean that you'd get the Three of Swords? And it sucks when something like that happens because it throws you for a loop. It's one thing to have the sun show up in a positive position, an empowering position of a spread, or, Three of Cups, Ten of Cups, those cards that are often deemed positive or uplifting. But what do you do when you have one of the Swords cards show up? So the underlying fear of the Three of Swords is the fear of heartbreak, grief, or loss. So, when that comes to light in a reading, the querent can understand better that perhaps the underlying fear of loss, or even grief and heartbreak, can be holding them back in some way or keeping them stuck. So the underlying fear of the Three of Swords is heartbreak, grief, or loss. And then we go to the Four of Swords. The underlying fear for the Four of Swords is a fear of illness, incapacitation, or even paralysis. There are some people that have a really, really dreaded fear of paralysis, of something like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, or being buried alive, or, being stuck in paralysis with anesthesia and they can't be awake, or that sleep paralysis and what have you, or even incapacitation or illness, especially people who identify strongly with vitality or their bodies. Perhaps they've been an athlete or what have you. And sometimes what is at the core of an extreme health regimen or exercise or health consciousness is the Four of Swords, which is a fear of illness, incapacitation, and paralysis. The next card is the Five of Swords. This underlying fear is the fear of embarrassment or shame. And I think, a lot of people have this deep-seated fear. Some of us just don't give a shit, but most people, I think, do. And that's what dictates their behavior. See, fear is more powerful than you think, because fear is not just a state. Fear is something that dictates actions, because if you fear something strong enough, you will actually make decisions and actions to avoid that fear. So if the fear is subconscious, you may not even realize why you're making the decisions that you do. And you may even justify it with a different decision. For example, I just had an interesting conversation with somebody on Etsy, and they were talking about our coffee deck, and they were saying how that they saw someone on YouTube make the comment on a coffee tarot that it's just gimmicky. But the person went on to say that they had originally backed our deck on Kickstarter, but then they canceled the pledge. Now, you wouldn't pledge money for a deck that you find gimmicky, would you? No. What I found out is the person recognized their name, and there were some people that were, how haters and jealous people are. They were being critical of me and some of the decisions I've made in the past, or my actions, or who knows what. And I have had haters who, for years, anytime my name will come up, they just can't resist chiming in to try to slander me, sully my reputation, or just spread lies or what have you. Well, this person, under peer pressure, apparently canceled their backing. But on YouTube, they said they canceled it because the deck was gimmicky. But here, this person who was communicating with me on Etsy about the deck said that they recognized the name, and they actually saw them say in a group that the reason they canceled it is because people kind of bullied them into it. Like, oh, how can you support her and her deck? And so she canceled because of that. And so there's the Five of Swords for you. So outwardly, these people who are jealous and they just can't stand to see somebody create or somebody successful, or who knows what their deal is, they have to try to sabotage someone else's work or creations or reputation. So on the surface, that's very Five of Swords, but also it was operating in this person's life, the person who canceled the backing, because of the group peer pressure of the Five of Swords bullying, the fear of embarrassment or shame. Embarrassed that, she would dare back, a deck that's, co-created by someone that other people don't like. So it's very petty and very immature and very middle school type of thing, but that's the Five of Swords for you. It's a very immature, petty energy, and, it's really powerful. That's why I love the Swords suit, because when you go deeper, you can really start uncovering those layers of fear or anxiety, or the deep roots of people's decisions or reactions. And then if you put that light upon yourself, you can have some exponential personal growth. And that's why another reason I think a lot of people don't like the Swords card, they don't like the truth, and that's why that funny line from the movie You Can't Handle the Truth is so popular. And of course, the metaphor from the Matrix, take the red pill, the red pill of truth. It's, not pretty. And it is surprising, and it is sometimes horrifying, but as truth can be. But it's a lot better, I think, than taking the blue pill of oblivion and ignorance. So the Five of Swords, the underlying fear there is fear of embarrassment or shame. A person just doesn't have strong third chakra to stand up and say, well, I don't care what you think of this person. I think the deck's cool, and I'm backing it. So easily, swayed. And if a person can be swayed from a small decision like that, can you imagine how they might be conducting their life and making the bigger decisions? A lot of people I don't think even realize why they make the decisions they do. So the Five of Swords is actually a very powerful card to get down to, okay, what is embarrassing me, or what is the sense of shame here? And, worst case scenario, so what, right? So let's move on to the Six of Swords. Now, in the Rider-Waite, this often shows what appears to be a woman with a child being ferried from turbulent waters to calmer waters. But in the Thoth tradition, it's called science, and that is more the interpretation that Ron and I chose to reflect in both the Snowland and the Coffee Tarot, more of a science and intellectual type of energy for the Six of Swords. But the fear underlying this card is the same no matter, your interpretation or orientation for this card. It's a fear of discovery and starting over. Now, one might say, well, why a fear of discovery? Well, imagine if scientists are supposed to have open minds, but what if they went in with a bias and they discovered information that flew in the face of what they assumed, or perhaps even what their peers or their overseers thought? There would be a fear of discovering something that is opposite of that. I mean, of course, if you're a maverick or a pioneer, it doesn't matter as much, but what if you're just your average, everyday scientist? What if scientists have actually found a correlation between vaccinations and autism? What if, then do you really think that they were going to, they would come to light with that? Or the fact that aspartame causes seizures and it's a neurotoxin and, it's really, really bad for you. There's a fear of discovery there. Not only a discovery of what, let's say, some kind of connection, but also what happens after the fact. I mean, can you imagine a federal government, how much money they would be owing people if they were found to have been sitting on data that proves, the danger of things like aspartame or vaccinations or what have you. So for the science aspect, there's that fear of discovery, but there's also a fear of starting over, because when you discover something, then you kind of have to scrap what you already knew. You have to scrap your preconceived notions. So there's also a fear of starting over. And I see the Six of Swords sometimes come up when somebody who's in an abusive relationship wants to leave. And one of the reasons that some people are afraid to leave an abusive relationship is the fear of starting over, of possibly even starting with nothing if they were dependent upon the abuser for their basic needs. So the underlying fears for the Six of Swords is fear of discovery and fear of starting over. This brings us to the Seven of Swords, one of my favorite cards in the deck, and often misaligned, I must say, or maligned, and I'll talk about that in a future podcast. I could probably do a few just on the Seven of Swords. Love the card. Anyway, the underlying fear for the Seven of Swords is a fear of being exposed or being caught. Now, some people call this the Thief card. I like to think of it as the strategy and cunning card, like you're playing a video game, and, if you're playing a video game, you don't want to be caught by the bad guy. You don't want to be overtaken by the ghost in Pac-Man. You don't want to fall into a pit. You don't want to, wreck your motorcycle if you Crash Bandicoot or what have you. So there's a Seven of Swords. There's a fear of being exposed for who you really are, or of being caught. Because a lot of times when people use strategy and cunning, they're trying to cover up something. Not always. I mean, sometimes strategy and cunning is a good thing. When you're trying to stay ahead of a pack, or, you're trying to be an innovator, or you're trying to figure out a gnarly problem. But sometimes there is a fear of being exposed, and sometimes people will create these labyrinthine personas, especially online, because they have a fear of being exposed for who they are. And so all their Instagram posts and Facebook posts show the airbrushed look and the perfectly arranged tarot card spreads with the crystals. And I mean, who the hell does that for a reading? Come on. Rose petals and flower petals and herbs. I just shake my head. But anyway, the underlying fear for the Seven of Swords is a fear of being exposed or a fear of being caught. Eight of Swords, the next card. This often shows a person who has loose bandages around them, and they are blindfolded as well, and they can easily get out. In our coffee tarot, it shows a prisoner who has a pardon on his bed. The door's open, the warden's there, come on, but he's still lingering around the window drinking coffee. So the Eight of Swords is a fear of freedom, and it's almost like better the devil you know than the one you don't. In our Snowland deck, it shows a marionette who still has the strings on him, and he's, holding a pair of scissors, and then there's these two, mannequin and a doll at the window, and they have it open, and they're like, come on, you can be free, the puppeteer's not around, you could cut those strings and come out the window with us. And it's Ron deliberately put red paint and blue paint on there as a nod to the Matrix, like whether you take the red pill of self-knowledge and truth and seeing things for what they are, or continue to take the blue pill and be caught in the reality that is not real at all. It's nothing but an illusion. So the Eight of Swords card is a fear of freedom. The lady doesn't cut the bandages and take off her blindfold because she'd actually rather be there. Better the devil you know than the one you don't. Fear of freedom. The next is pretty self-explanatory. The Nightmare card, Nine of Swords. There is a fear of fear or fear of anxiety. And, I think that's my greatest fear, is the fear of fear or fear of anxiety. There's that famous quote, the only fear is fear itself, and it's true for some people, that is actually their greatest fear. They don't like that state of fear or anxiety, and that's what they fear above all. And that is an underlying, again, it might seem self-evident. Well, of course, this is the fear of anxiety card of the tarot, but a fear of fear and a fear of anxiety is a little bit different. And again, it goes back to motivations and the kind of decisions we might make to try to avoid a certain state, what our greatest fear might be. With the Ten of Swords, this is a fear of dementia or madness. If you think of it numerologically, there you go, numerologically, 10 is a fulfillment of a suit. It's kind of it could be an overkill, especially with the wands or the swords. And, it shows a man lying prone on the ground with 10 swords in his body. And our Coffee Tarot is kind of a funny card that Ron posed for that shows an exposed brain with like 10 different sharp instruments embedded in his brain, like a pin and a X-Acto knife and like all these sharp instruments. And that's because, again, the swords is a mental suit, an intellectual suit. So if you have an overkill, there is, a fear of dementia or madness. What if my brain stops working the way it should? What if it just poops out on me? And, with some of us, entering our 40s and 50s, and our parents are aging, and we see some of our parents, unfortunately, going through Alzheimer's or dementia, we see how it could just totally wreck a life. You can have somebody who has had a PhD or who's sharper than a tack, and then, Alzheimer's hits and, it basically reduces them to a petulant, toddler who doesn't even recognize you, and it's very sad. So a Ten of Swords is an underlying fear of dementia or madness or losing your mind. So let's go to the court cards. Now, the Page of Swords, this is similar to the Five of Swords, the fear of embarrassment or shame. But the Page of Swords is more of fear of what people will think and gossip. And so, the Page of Swords is often like the little spy, the motor mouth, the stool pigeon, the tattletale, the gossip. And so, Page of Swords is often, especially with kids, and it's an immature energy because, again, it's a page. It's a fear of what people think. It's a fear of gossip, whereas the Five of Swords is more a fear of embarrassment or shame. It's perhaps a deeper-seated feeling and a little bit more nebulous, whereas Page of Swords is very specific. What will people think? Or fear of people talking about your gossip. Knight of Swords is a fear of violence. I think the Knight of Swords is the most violent card in the deck. I think when it shows up, it is a very dangerous card, especially in relationships. I once did a reading for a woman, and she wanted to know whether she should move in with her boyfriend. And this card came up, and I told her. She didn't listen, and wouldn't you know, she moved in with him, eventually married him. He was in an altercation in a bar, and he brought a gun in with him. The gun went off. Fortunately, no one was killed. He shot himself, the idiot. And, there he is. And, fear of violence, so Knight of Swords, the underlying fear there is, especially if this comes up reversed or if it comes up in a relationship, is the fear of violence. On some level, a person knows that there is a tendency for violence when this card comes up. The atmosphere is very ripe. Then we go to the Queen of Swords. The Queen of Swords, the underlying fear is fear of incompetence. The Queen of Swords is the master reviewer and the person who analyzes. She's like a school marm in a way, a school superintendent, somebody who focuses on intellectual excellence. And, so the underlying fear of that sometimes is a fear of incompetence, the fear of being seen as incompetent or fear of judging yourself as incompetent. Especially in relation to others. And then that's because the queen nurtures those kind of things. And so, the fear of incompetence would be kind of the opposite of that, like dropping the ball in the intellectual arena and, missing a few grammar mistakes or misspellings. It ranges in the fear, of course. There's fear of really petty mistakes, but then there's a fear of very public or very big mistakes that can influence and impact others. And then we move on to the King of Swords. The King of Swords is a fear of irrationality. Think Spock here, Spock on Star Trek. There's a fear of whatever is deemed irrational, and that can include emotions, sentimentality, but it also can include faith. Like a lot of the people that are really rabid atheists, I have to wonder if there is that King of Swords not only in the I am a ruler of the intellectual realm, or I am seen as a leader of this realm or a distributor of knowledge in this realm. But I have to wonder sometimes if there's a fear of irrationality there, or is a fear of being seen as irrational, a fear of emotions, sentimentality, and any type of spirituality, spiritual experience, or religion or faith. And so they go in the other direction and become a fundamentalist in the atheist department, which is really funny because when you have a fear of something, you tend to overcompensate. Not always, but, if somebody's always bitching about a certain person or a certain issue, like a lot of these evangelists really hitting hard about, sexual infidelity, like Jim Bakker used to, and Jimmy Swaggart and people like that. Well, when the screwing the secretary or seeing prostitutes on the weekend without anybody knowing, a lot of the people that go, talk about, the preciousness of human life and they're anti-abortion, then you find out that they paid for, a couple mistresses to have an abortion. Anthony Weiner supposedly was cracking down on, sexual crimes and what have you. And then here he is cheating on, Hillary Clinton's advisor. Huma Abedin was his wife. So, somebody who bitches or complains or crusades against something, usually have a problem with that issue or there's a fear of it. Not always, but usually. So King of Swords, again, is a fear of any type of irrationality or what they see, what they deem to be irrational, like emotions, faith, and sentimentalism, and maybe perhaps even the tender and sweeter parts of life. So I hope you enjoyed this tour of the scary tarot sword suit. What are they afraid of? And feel free to get in contact with me through my website, janetboyer.com, if you have any additional thoughts or spins on these cards. And let me know if you like this podcast and how it might have helped you. And again, these fears, can be seen through reverse cards or ill-dignified cards, but also sometimes when this card shows up in a positive position of a spread and you're like, oh my gosh, how in the world am I supposed to interpret that? Well, first thing to ask yourself is, what are they afraid of? What is this card afraid of, and how does it deal with the question in hand and the querent in hand? And I think you'll find that it's very illuminating, because remember, the solution to all the negative vibes or challenges of a suit lies in the ace of that suit. So the Ace of Swords is your clarity, that pin that busts the balloons of confusion, illusion, and self-delusion. It's the flashlight, okay? All right, well, thank you so much for listening to me, and I appreciate you following me on Podbean and taking time to let me know that you like the podcast. And I'll see you next time on The Naked Tarot. Again, this is Janet Boyer from janetboyer.com. Bye-bye.